What's up, you guys? Welcome to The Imagination. I'm your host, Emma, and today I'm honored to have back on the show United Church minister turned whistleblower, Canadian hero, humanitarian, father of two, published writer and author, public speaker and podcaster, documentary filmmaker, Nobel Peace Prize nominee, co-founder of the International Tribunal into Crimes of Church and State, righteous soul, and eagle strong voice, Kevin Annett. In case you missed either of Kevin's two past episodes or the movie night feature where we aired his acclaimed documentary Unrepentant, here is a brief intro into his testimony and background, along with some information on what we'll be talking about today. Born in Edmonton in 1956, Kevin's early life was steeped in a deep sense of justice and curiosity about the world. Educated at the University of British Columbia, he earned degrees in anthropology, political science, and beyond, preparing him for a life of service. Ordained in 1990, he began his ministry in Port Alberni, British Columbia in 1992, unaware that this small coastal town would become the crucible for his life's mission. It was here, among a community scarred by poverty and historical trauma, that Kevin first heard the heart-wrenching stories of Indigenous survivors of the residential schools, stories of abuse, cultural erasure, and unimaginable loss. What began as an effort to open his church's doors to Indigenous congregants quickly transformed into a profound awakening. Survivors shared accounts of physical, sexual, and psychological abuse, including deliberate programming designed to silence them through fear, shame, and self-destruction. Kevin learned of the sinister mechanisms of mind control, techniques rooted in trauma-based programming akin to the CIA's MKUltra experiments used to break spirits and to ensure compliance. Kevin's pursuit of truth came at a profound personal cost. His refusal to stay silent led to his dismissal from the United Church in 1995, followed by a campaign of defamation, blacklisting, and the painful loss of his family. Yet these trials only deepened his resolve. He saw the parallels between the survivors' program silence and the societal denial that shielded the perpetrators. Undeterred, he founded the International Tribunal into Crimes of Church and State in 2010, uniting survivors across 26 countries to seek justice. The ITCCS prosecuted figures like Pope Benedict and Canadian officials for crimes against humanity, sparking global awareness of child trafficking and institutional abuse. Kevin's work also delves into the chilling reality of mind control programming, which is what we will be diving deeper into today. He's uncovered how trauma-based techniques such as electroshock, sensory deprivation, and psychological abuse were employed in residential schools, ensuring victims remain voiceless. His book, Murder by Decree, documents these horrors, revealing how such programming was not only a crime against individuals, but a part of a broader genocidal agenda. Despite facing relentless opposition, including smear campaigns and threats, Kevin's heart remains with the survivors. His books, along with his weekly radio show, continue to educate and inspire. His efforts have even been recognized with Nobel Peace Prize nominations, reflecting his global impact. Kevin's life and message are a call to action, a reminder that one person's courage can pierce the veil of silence and bring light to the darkest corners. For survivors of abuse, Kevin is a steadfast ally, helping them reclaim their voice and heal from the scars of mind control and abuse. His work challenges us all to confront injustice, honor the resilience of survivors, and build a world where truth and compassion prevail. Through his tireless advocacy, Kevin proves that even in the face of overwhelming odds, a single heart driven by love and justice can change the course of history. Before wrapping up the introduction of today's guest, I'd like to share just a couple of quick reminders and updates. If you're interested in being a guest on the show, if you wanted to share any information privately with me, or if you were interested in submitting a written testimony for my upcoming book series or to be featured on a Substack article, you can reach out to me via email at imagineabetterworld2020@gmail.com or standbysurvivors@protonmail.com. Additionally, I've teamed up with a couple of my favorite brands to offer you guys exclusive discount codes on products I love, such as Rife Technology frequency machines and CZTL's premium methylene blue. You can find all the relevant links and codes along with other resources down below in the show notes. Your support across all platforms is greatly appreciated, as I've had to shift to alternative streaming platforms such as Rumble and X, following the extreme censorship that caused my last YouTube channel to be terminated. I've just recently started a new YouTube channel, and you can subscribe to me there at the handle at Imagination Podcast Official that I am now streaming new episode premieres from weekly. This transition to multiple platforms is crucial to continue sharing vital information with the public and disclosure community. So thank you all wholeheartedly on the other side of the screen for helping to make the imagination the safest space on the internet for survivor, whistleblower, advocate, and educator disclosures. Your support means the absolute world to me and to every guest on the show. So, you guys, without further ado, please help me in welcoming back today's guest of honor, voice for the voiceless, relentless victim and survivor advocate, passionate purveyor of truth, content creator, human rights activist, absolute warrior, and a man whose actions speak louder than any words, the one, the only, Kevin Annett. Kevin, welcome back. Thank you so much for being here again with us today. It's an honor.
Thank you so much, Emma, for having me back.
Absolutely. These talks have been so valuable. There's things that aren't talked about enough for obvious reasons that you've stated the last two episodes, but I think your story and your own personal story, along with what you've uncovered in your research and your own whistleblowing and advocacy work, it really ties together a plethora of different sort of networks that almost get talked about separately. For
Hmm.
example, the abuse at residential schools, that's usually very separate from, say, something like mind control, which we're going to dive into a little bit
Right.
more today, which is also a little bit different than the child trafficking talks that go on a lot. And I think what you've been able to do through actually being there for different survivors, listening to their stories, digging deeper and researching, you've really been able to uncover and connect a lot of dots that bring these things together and show a broader picture. So I'm really excited to dive into that today. Um, and I wanted to start by asking you, again, your work parallels the topic that we're going to be diving into a little bit more today, mind control. And in the intro, I covered a couple different things that do parallel, such as some of the abuse methods that were used on these children. But I wanted to ask you, when did you start to piece together that what you were uncovering at these residential schools seemed experimental, seemed different than maybe some abuses that you'd have heard of?
Yeah.
And did certain survivors ever, I guess, parallel through what they disclosed to you, things along with mind control, such as having dissociation and some of the commonalities that MK Ultra survivors have had?
Well, it really began the very first survivor I ever spoke to. And this wasn't just in Port Alberni, it preceded that because I did a lot of community work in Vancouver. Back in the 1980s, when I was at university, I paid my way through by working in the psych ward on the campus and in community mental health. So I worked in halfway homes and everything. So I had a lot of contact with people who had been through these experiments, right? And who were dissociated, had all the symptoms of people who had been worked on. And so in a way, I was kind of like with other things, I was almost pre-adapted to, once I went to Port Alberni, to be able to recognize these signs right away. Because as you say, when there's a huge societal crime, it's always cut up into little pieces and separated so nobody can understand the nature of the beast behind it all. They just looked at the little parts. Then you talk about residential schools as a separate issue, and trauma-based mind control. They're all out there. But the point is, what we've found over the years by staying at this campaign is that they're all integrated. And it came out of a post-World War II culture, which was helped by the Cold War, because the early mind control experiments were justified by saying, the Russians and the North Koreans are doing this to prisoners of war. We have to understand mind control to counter that. In fact, a lot of the early mind control research were pioneered by the Nazis, based on earlier work done in America by psychiatrists, actually in the 19th century. And the basic underlying question is, how do you control the population? How does a few people control the many? Now, of course, over the centuries, there have been a lot of means to do that, right? Through intimidation, violence. Often that's the best way to keep people in line, the threat of violence. But it became much more sophisticated based on the Nazi research. And it took off, as you know, in the 1950s with the MK Ultra research. And the best fronts they operated behind were hospitals and churches. So for example, we learned early on that Native children and other children in institutions, prisoners, military personnel, were on the front line of people who were being used in these experiments. In terms of, the specific aspect that you mentioned about the so-called residential schools, the very first person who ever spoke to me described, um, being taken into a padded cell and getting electric shocks to their head. And they said this happened. It was in the first week, actually. I began to interview survivors. His name was Kenny Quatel, and he was a native man from northern Vancouver Island. And he said he was kept in the Nanaimo Indian Hospital for several years. His parents had been told he had died on the operating table because he had spinal bifida. And they took him in, kept him in a padded cell, experimented on him. And the way he described it, of course, people have kind of recollection problems unless they're under hypnosis or find ways of kind of recalling the deep trauma. But, he said the things he was describing were all the classic experiments and methods they use to probe the kind of the nature of human consciousness and how you can control it. And it's interesting because another person who was held in these Indian hospitals, and I'll talk about them in a minute, what they were created under special legislation whereby the church and the military operated these experimental centers together, the Catholics, the Anglicans, and especially the United Church that I was in. But, this other woman said was that when they were being held in these facilities, there was doctors there who didn't speak English and they needed translators. And she was this woman, one of the women who was held there, Virginia Baptiste. She said that when she was a child there in the 50s, she looked and one of the doctors had a tattoo right there with funny numbers on it. Well, that's all the SS were given branded there with a tattoo. And we actually, from other witnesses in these Indian hospitals across the country, we were able to match some of these tattoos, the numbers, with records from Europe of the Simon Wiesenthal Center, a very extensive center in Vienna where they have the names and the numbers of all the SS. And it was a guy called Hans Lehmann. He was a SS doctor who worked in Auschwitz with Josef Mengele in a lot of these early mind control experiments. Now, in other words, I began running across all these people as soon as I began to do this work. And it showed me early on that this wasn't simply a place which was the cover story, and it still is, a place to, assimilate Native children into white culture, right, and give them an education. That's all a cover story. These were experimental and killing centers. And so that was apparent to me early on, but it's still not known to the general populace because they don't have that sense of really what's behind all of this, right?
100%. And that was when I was watching your documentary, studying the work that you've done, and really looking into some of the interviews where you've explained some of this abuse, not to mention on your documentary, Unrepentant, you bring on tons of victims who are survivors now, who explain some of their abuses, and you just think, you know, this isn't just taking a paddle and spanking a kid like what you'd maybe picture in a school setting. Some of those really old school abuses were really disgusting that they used to do on children back in the day. That's, I think, what people expect when you hear about an abuse happening in a school. But you read about and listen to these survivors and listen to what you've been told through all these disclosures. These were really heinous things that they were doing to these kids. Even in your documentary, you talk about them pushing kids downstairs, putting children in rooms with sick children who had fatal diseases.
Right.
And you think, this is not just, spanking a kid. Like there's something systemic happening here where these adults
Right.
have pre-planned what they're doing.
Well, that was the extermination aspect. They had a death quota, and this is all in murderbydecree.com. There was an annual death quota. They had to kill a certain number of children every year. And this is affirmed in letters, and looking at the actual statistics over about a 60-year period, the average death rate never went down below between 40 and 60%. Now, to give a sense of perspective, in Auschwitz and Treblinka, which were work camps as well as extermination centers, the average death rate was about 25%. So we're talking double that. So these are outright extermination, but in the course of doing that, um, you know, they also were perfecting mind control techniques. And, there was, in a way, it's inherent in these institutions that you got to get all the kids conformed and thinking in a certain way. And people often do that from terror, but, just simply by being terrorized. But there's more sophisticated methods they began to perfect. And I'll give you an example. There was I mentioned these Indian hospitals. They were set up by special legislation where the churches would bring in their missionary doctors, and because churches are above the law, they're in their own jurisdiction, they could do whatever they wanted with these children. So um, there's this photo of these three, there were four of them actually, who ran away from a Catholic hospital up in northern BC. It was called the LeJacques School, but it had what they called a clinic attached to it. In fact, what they were doing, there were pain threshold experiments. And you remember in stories of Auschwitz, they would take prisoners and just take them naked and throw them out into the snow to see how long they would be able to live, to get, to perfect methods whereby the military could protect their soldiers better in winter, right? What are the limits of the human body to cold? Well, that's what happened to these four kids. They were found dead, naked in their underwear in the middle of winter, January 1937. Okay, note the date. At the same hospital, there were German-speaking doctors operating. This is before World War II, not after. This is not Project Paperclip. Canada had a joint agreement with Nazi Germany in chemical warfare and pain threshold experiments in the 1930s, right? They were collaborating. William Lyon Mackenzie King, the prime minister, was openly pro-Hitler. And, it's why so many Nazis were brought into Canada after the war. There was that whole kind of racist Jew-hating culture already. And so it was a perfect medium for a lot of these experiments to happen. So the cover story created by the Canadian media who published that picture was, oh no, these children were just trying to get home in the middle of winter to see their families, and they dressed them up like this. There they are in winter clothing and everything. In fact, I've read the report of the doctor who did the initial autopsy. And he was actually, his father worked in the Alberni Residential School, was the principal. His name was Dr. Pitts. And Dr. Pitts writes a report January 4th, 1937, saying these children were found naked. There is no way we can claim that they were trying to get home. They were, literally, they were found naked, dead in the snow. And 2 days later, after the official inquiry, he says the exact opposite. He said, no, they were fully clothed trying to get home to the parents. So in 2 days, the doctor, whether they put a gun in his mouth or whatever, he changes the report. And now that's still the official line in Canada. This is the only picture ever published in the Canadian mainstream showing dead children from a residential school. And it's a doctored photo. So that's coming out of, an experimental program at this LeJacques School to throw the kids out in the snow and see how long they live, right? By the very doctors, likely, who would then do it a few years later in Auschwitz, right? So, here's one, that's kind of one example of a pain threshold experiment, but there were also mind control experiments. And I mentioned where Kenny Quatel was in the Nanaimo Indian Hospital, where they held him for years in this padded cell. One of the women who was there, her name was Ethel Wilson, and she was held in the same hospital. She sat down with us outside the Nanaimo Indian Hospital grounds, and it's all a military ground. It's a former military base. So, it could be controlled and nobody allowed in. She drew a picture. She sat down with a psychic investigator and described what she remembers. And she drew a picture of a human head, and there were these probes going up the nostril into the midbrain area. And this is a psychic investigator who's used regularly by the police on Vancouver Island to find missing people. Her name was Yvonne. She came with us to the first dig we did in the Brantford School where we found the bones. She literally pointed out where to dig, and we found them. So she's very adept at this stuff. And anyway, she did the reading, and she said, oh yeah, they were inserting things into the midbrain area to separate the ganglia in the brain to isolate critical thinking. They were trying to create, and when you look at the notes, she was scribbling down the stuff, and she said they wanted to create the perfect slave. Like, it was robot creation. So you create people who are able to function, but they don't have critical reasoning. They don't have the ability to act on anything. They just obey orders. And that was part of these surgical techniques to do that in the Nanaimo Indian Hospital. Now, the year after we made this stuff public, the government sealed all Indian hospital records, officially sealed them, so you can't see them anymore. The National Archives in Ottawa and everything closed down in 1999, right the year after our tribunal. Well, actually, not even 6 months after we went public with this. So, they've obviously got a lot in there to hide, but she was very clear that from Joan, or rather Yvonne, from the reading she got, that this is part of a huge experimental program. And in fact, another woman, Gail Perkins, who I interviewed on one of the Gulf Islands off the BC coast, she had been held in an experimental program at the Lincoln Park Air Force Base in Calgary, again run by the United Church, the federal government, the Canadian military. And she saw this Heinz Lehman there, that's the guy with that SS tattoo. And she was part of a group of 20 children who were all tortured to death by this guy. And they wanted her, and he kind of used her. They keep one child alive as a control element. They can study over the years to see how well the conditioning takes. And that was what happened to Gail. And he kind of treated her like a little mascot, and he was describing to her everything going on. He said, we're seeing how much pain the human body can take before it shuts down. This has military applications, right? And so he drew a direct connection between the Canadian military. He was operating under a Royal Canadian Air Force cover by the name Major Bob Armstrong. And that was in fact confirmed. The Canadian government came to them. She and her husband tried to sue the Canadian government for compensation for what she'd suffered there. This guy, Sergeant Dan Gassot from the Military Intelligence Service in Ottawa, comes out, interviews her, and says, I've looked up all the files. This Bob Armstrong was a Waffen SS colonel. He operated all of the mind control experiments across Canada, not just in this one place. He was in charge of the whole thing. And he then goes back, like this guy really believed in her case and wanted to fight for her. A week later, they get a phone call from him and says, we never had this conversation. I never spoke to you. If you try to pursue this, you're going to go to jail. And that was it. Turned off quick. And so, that's always a good sign that you're onto something when these things happen. But I mean, that's a taste of what, some of what what we've learned over going into the so-called residential schools. It's part of a much bigger monster, right?
Absolutely. Now, in your working with survivors, hearing so many disclosures from these residential school survivors that are in Canada, did any of them ever share anything similar to MK Ultra survivors where they had programmed parts that they were discovering that they had, or they remember being deliberately dissociated? Do you remember, or have you heard anything about that through them?
Constantly. Although that when people are in a talking circle, they don't see it as that right away. They don't understand that they're the victims of an experiment and these methods, right? But they have the same dissociative kind of reactions. There was a woman, Anne Diamond, that's her writer's name. She's a Montreal writer. She and her brother were held in the Allen Memorial Institute of Montreal, which was the major recipient of MK Ultra CIA money during the 1950s and 60s. And they would bring in children. As a matter of fact, Anne tells me that she remembers being in a room where they were bringing native children in cages, literally. And they were brought from the local reservation. The tribal council chief would literally sell these children to them off the reservation because he was the government-funded puppet chief, and he did what he was told. And they were brought in cages. You might want to look him up, Dr. Wilder Penfield. He was a Nobel, I believe he's a laureate. He ran a thing called the Montreal Neurological Institute, the MNI, and he's the first one to develop in brain surgery. You can stimulate parts of the brain, and you'll hear memory. You hear music from your childhood. Memories will come back. So he's probing how to control the brain, and she remembers him torturing to death children on the operating table at the Allen Institute, and a lot of these native children, he said, were being brought from these residential schools. There he is, yeah. And So it runs all through the system. And what's interesting is there was a lawsuit brought by survivors of this, of the Allen Institute. And it's exactly what happened to the Native survivors. The same cover up, the same gag order. They said, yeah, you can have $10,000 compensation, which is the exact figure they offered Native children, residential school survivors. So it's the same system at work. $10,000, but you're gagged. You can never talk about it. You legally indemnify the government and the hospital and the churches that did this. And that's unfortunately these people who are protesting, they all get sucked into the legal system, which is designed to conceal it, protect the perpetrators, and fog it from memory so that these things can continue. Because the point is, all of these things, they're all parts of the same puzzle of what we're living under now, which is a very mind-controlled society. The techniques they tried out in these places are now applied to all of us. And I want to talk a little bit about that in a bit, about how the stages, first it was physical and then chemical, and now it's electronic-based mind control. And again, these Native children and others were the initial guinea pigs, but now all of us are, right?
100%. I want to talk about that too. I do want to ask you before we go on to that. You had mentioned, I brought up the YouTube video about the Canadians that are right now protesting that. Could you talk just a little bit more about that? I know you said that it's the wrong way to go about it, but it actually made some news headlines
Yeah.
that have reached out here in America. There's actually people, it's kind of circulating. And it's kind of interesting. So it's at least bringing the awareness of the words MKUltra a little more public because it's being publicized.
Yeah.
But you know a couple survivors that are in this protesting and trying to get this lawsuit. And do you want to talk just a little bit about what all they're trying to do?
Yeah, it's been an effort. I mean, 20 years ago, people were pushing for this and it wasn't allowed, but it's being allowed now because the big spin operation is in place. They've destroyed most of the evidence. Most of the survivors are gone. So it's safe now for the system to allow this to be talked about. And I remember that quote from that CIA training manual back in the 70s. And it says, you can't stop change, but you can guide it. You can guide a revolution, you can guide change. And the way they guide it now is to say, okay, yeah, we can't ignore the issue because then we'll look like we're concealing it. We'll talk about the issue, we'll allow a court case, but it'll be very regulated. So these folks will be allowed to talk about certain things, but it's a carbon copy of what happened with Native people. This, quote, Truth and Reconciliation Commission didn't allow talk about dead children, didn't allow you to sue anyone, couldn't use your testimony in court. The government owned your testimony, so the serial killer gets to determine what you talk about his crimes, and so it's a very guided process. And at the end of the day, people will think, and this is what they're meant to think, yeah, these horrible crimes happened a long time ago, and now we're acknowledging it, and we're giving compensation, and we're sorry. No, we're not sorry, we apologize. And an apology under the law is to indemnify yourself, to say, I didn't do anything wrong. That's the meaning of the word if you look it up in the dictionary. An apologetic is to defend an action, not to say you're sorry. So they couch it in the frame of looking at something, but in fact they're not. They're making it, separating it so that people can't make the connection between what happened to those people protesting and what's happening to you right now, in this culture, right?
Absolutely, yes. And I do think that that's interesting and it's wonderful that finally there's groups of survivors actually getting together and trying to do something, even if it's not the best way to go about it, or it might not benefit them or the movement necessarily. What a time we live in where we can now connect and people are making connections and doing things as a group instead of Kathy O'Brien, 25, 30 years ago, going at this by herself and not really being able to connect with people.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's the very fact of people coming together is important. It's kind of like holding a protest. It's good because we have a sense of strength of numbers. But the question is, then what do you do with it? Are you asking for something from the criminal themselves? No, we're not. We're creating our own justice. And that's why it feeds into our whole discussion of common law courts and how it has to be on your terms. So when your initial impulse is to not only meet together and share stories, but then hold a protest or go to the main corporate media, right, with the story. And as Sun Tzu says in The Art of War, the moment you begin to operate on the terrain of the enemy, you've lost. You might as well not do anything because you're going to lose in the sense that they will control the outcome. But we have to define for ourselves, and this is what survivors should do as soon as they meet. And I hope that coming out of the show, we can help organize survivors in that way. The first thing we should ask themselves is, forget about asking for anything. What do you want? What is justice for you? What is it going to look like? And you never hear people, I never heard people in the early talking circles say, we need money, we need compensation. Their leaders did, because the lawyers and the leaders of these people are all going to profit from it. But you never hear people talking about money and compensation, because anyone knows you can never be compensated for this. No amount of money is ever going to make up. It might help alleviate some things, but it also goes with a gag order. And the one thing you can never give up as a survivor is the ability to speak about what happened to you. And that's the first thing they do. They take away your voice. They say you can never talk about it again. Well, that's, I've known people who that happens to, and then they go kill themselves in despair. Because what's the point of bringing this out is then you're silenced again, right? So you don't want to re-traumatize people by silencing them again. If you were concerned about them, if the system was genuinely concerned, that's the last thing they'd do. They wouldn't gag people, they'd encourage them to speak and name the names. But then when you name the names, you're implicating people in the top of the system. So of course, then, they're going to find a way to avoid that. That's why we organize internationally our own system of support, our own common law courts and assemblies. Always operate on your own terms. It's harder in the long and takes longer, but it pays off more in the long run.
Absolutely. And I know we're going to talk about that a little bit later, the
Yeah.
solution-oriented
Yeah.
effects of what we can all do together to combat what you're going to be talking about. And so I love that your research, again, just spans so much to where you can connect all these dots all the way to the sort of the origins of all of this and connecting these different aspects of disclosure to then the solution aspect and what can work, and so I'm really excited to talk to you about that. Before we get into the history, I want to tie in your books. I wanted to bring up a few books that we had talked about
Mm-hmm.
that actually sort of bring these narratives together of the trauma-based mind control as well as the residential school abuse in a way that people can maybe read through fiction or nonfiction in the stories that you've wrote to have a better idea of how these things come together. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about that.
Okay, well, the basic book where you can see a lot of the strings leading to these issues documented, A Murder by Decree, the book that we wrote in response to the TRC cover-up that the government did in 2016. So this book has been out for like 10 years. It's also up online, murderbydecree.com. You can see the whole text there. And it has, again, a lot of the eyewitness testimonies describing these methods and the Indian hospitals, the Nazi connection early on in a lot of this research. So, that's kind of more meat on the subject. Now, I also wrote two other things I wanted to show, because I want to get this message across in other mediums. I wrote a play called The Land of No One. And this is this play has been banned twice in Canada and once in America. We tried to produce it on the west coast of Canada, and it got shut down right in production. We had the cast, we were doing rehearsals, and then boom, the local government chiefs started threatening people, and so the director and the other actors dropped out of this. Then we tried it in Toronto, the same thing. And we tried it in San Francisco with the theater group there, and they initially were interested, but they said, well, you criticize vaccination, so we can't, produce this. So anyway, the reason that's so, quote, controversial is it is a story about, it's only got 5 characters, but the protagonists are this guy called Dr. Oliver Pierpoint. He was a doctor, a white church missionary doctor who worked at the Nanaimo Indian Hospital. And his wife and daughter really never knew much about what he did. And a survivor, a Native woman called Sheila Ambrose, comes forward and starts talking and contacts him and said, you did this to me. I want justice. And then there's a reporter, a young reporter who's trying to cover the story, and he's learning all these things. And it starts as a story about what happens in one white Canadian family when the truth comes home to roost, right? And you have to deal with these things. But at the end, it's kind of evolves more into how these methods are now being used against us. And there's this conversation at the end of the play between the doctor and the reporter who's asking these naive questions. And the doctor said, well, in another 10 years, no one will be asking those questions because their thoughts will be so controlled they won't even think about these things, right? And these are the methods that we developed, and they're very effective now in the electronic medium. And so it's no wonder some people got upset over this because, and I think one of the reasons the Native chiefs on Vancouver shut it down is one of these guys, Joe Thorne, his father was the very one who gathered up children on Vancouver Island and brought them into the Namo Indian Hospital for experiments. So that hit a nerve with their family. He said, "Uh-oh, we can't have dad, exposed here," because they got money, the chiefs, and they still do. Providing children for all of these drug testing things. That was a big one as well in these hospitals. All of the major drug companies, that are now pushing COVID virus, and they experimented for years, committed medical genocide on generations of children in these places, right? So anyway, that's that book on the play, and maybe someday some people will have the guts to actually produce it somewhere. And the other one, of course, is it's kind of a short little extended short story I wrote called The Church Lady. And it's kind of written in I don't know if you read detective novels, but this detective is hired to find a missing Anglican churchwoman. And the more he probes who she is, he discovers that she had provided a lot of the funding for one of these other Indian hospitals, the RW Large Hospital in Bella Bella, which is up the coast of British Columbia. And she finds there's a Chinese connection. There's big Chinese companies using that research now to develop these mind control technologies, including through the vaccines, which inject nanoparticles in the system. And that's part of the mind control technique, because in essence, what they do is they create a 5-point energy grid where the human body becomes a receiver of signals. So you literally become a component in a device to get messages unconsciously and direct your thoughts and memories and feelings and everything. So he discovers that in the course of an investigation. So I'm trying to find a way to appeal to different groups to get this message across, of what we're facing today.
Yeah, and you're doing an amazing job. I mean, even just reading this is Kevin's 24th book. You've just done so much. That's really amazing how many different ways, including doing podcasts, creating a documentary. You really have gone the extra mile in every single aspect possible to get this message out to every different type of person, whether they read, whether they watch podcasts, whether they'd rather watch it in a movie format, and even going into the communities and actually being with survivors and helping them and going to different events and, being a local champion too for the people in your own country that, are suffering and haven't really had a voice. So I'm going to have all three of those books in the show notes. Of course, all Kevin's books really do tie a lot of this together, right down to the common law books, right down to the whistleblower guide that he has. All of his books really tie this in, but these three specifically, if you guys want to learn and again experience through reading different ways that trauma-based mind control is a collaborative effort with a lot of these residential school abuse strategies. Those books, I think, would be a really great way for you guys to sort of see how all of this is interconnected in so many ways. And thank you, Kevin, again, for all the work that you do. I know that this has to have just been so tireless for you. And, most people haven't even written one book, much less, a couple dozen. So your work, it really does it stands on its own. It's going to stand the test of time. And we're all really grateful for everything that you're doing.
Well, thank you. And, it's kind of like I always have to say that none of those books would have been possible unless I met the people themselves who risked a lot more than I did. And a number of them paid with their lives for bringing this truth out. And I always honor them and all those children we don't know about who are in the ground and who are suffering now in these experiments, right? And we have an obligation, if we're going to remain human, to talk about this, that the kinds of things that, people naturally don't want to hear about, but have to if you're concerned about your own children, your own lives,
Absolutely, yes. And so let's get into talking about the timeline of mind control. I think
Yeah.
you have a really great way of breaking this down and helping us understand it. Because again, we do hear about it in very compartmentalized ways. And
Yeah.
I think having the full picture of sort of the historical elements of it, as well as how it looks today, is so important for us to understand. So I'd love for you to present some of that to us and, to give us sort of an idea of what you found in your research.
Well, as you mentioned, some of this is available. The literature on what MK Ultra was and is, um, and how it got started and everything. As with something like eugenics, like the attempt to create a quote master race through sterilizations, selective breeding, all that stuff, it got started in a big way in America in the late 19th century. And the Germans and the Nazis picked it up and copied it, although it was kind of like a cross Atlantic phenomena happening where people were trying to figure out how do you control and create a herd that can simply be manipulated. Now, that's always been the priority of any bunch of elite rulers, right? How to do that. The technology to develop that really started in a big way after World War II, and that's a period that's best documented. So I want to kind of focus on that. In the early period, say from the 30s right up to the 1960s, it's stage one is like physical methods of mind control. So, for example, lobotomies. That's one obvious one. Early forms of lobotomy is they call it transorbital, where they would go in above the eyeball and stick a metal probe in and separate, in the picture that the woman drew in the Namoini Hospital of inserting stuff into the midbrain through the nostril. They separate the frontal, nerve connections here, and you lose ability for critical thinking. And an infamous example of that, there was a movie made about this with Jessica Lange called Frances, Frances. It's about a Hollywood actress, Frances Farmer, who was in the 1930s. She was very militant. She was a political radical. She challenged the establishment in America, and she challenged the Hollywood kind of director or the movie mogul monopoly in Hollywood. And she was seen as a troublemaker. So they set her up for an arrest. They committed her to Steilacoom, which I don't know if you saw the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest with Jack Nicholson. You should see it because it's based in Steilacoom. And that's where this guy, Dr. Jose Delgado, developed the first lobotomy techniques. They lobotomized Frances and turned her into a vegetable, basically. Could barely speak, and held it up like kind of when you defrock somebody like they did me publicly. As an example, this is going to happen to you if you people step out of line, right? They always make it public to show, to get people scared from these things. So those lobotomy techniques and hypnosis, that kind of thing, was in the early stages. But then from a lot of the Nazi researchers, there was stage two is really chemical, attempt to control the human mind and behavior through chemical means. That's from the 50s right up to the 90s. And you had things developed, and we got a lot of evidence of this, places like not only Indian hospitals attached to the residential schools, but places like the Lakehead Psychiatric Hospital in Thunder Bay, Ontario, the Allen Institute, all over America, in university hospitals had these techniques, developing drugs like one was called Largactil. It was an early version of the rape drug, where if you administer it to someone, they lose, they appear to be conscious, but they've lost the capacity to resist or to think. They become a purely functional intelligence. You go around, you're able to operate in the world, but you can't, if something happens, you can't question it or say, hey, is that right? Critical reasoning is gone, just wipe clean, boom, and you respond to orders or conditioning. And of course, a lot of people are like that anyway. We are raised to be habitual thinkers, right? So people are raised like in a classroom, just, you learn a rote thing and that's reality. And you adhere to the reality even when it doesn't make sense. And you learn to operate enough intelligence to be able to operate any day, but not to challenge things the way they are. Because you notice when you talk to your friends or family or anyone about the ideas they may not have heard about or that challenge their whole basis of how they view things, they'll just reject it outright. That can't be. That's just impossible. Right? That's habitual thinking at work, and that's how a population is programmed anyway. But these chemicals exacerbate that. They make it so that there's no coming back. Once you're changed that way chemically, it's hard to recover your original identity. But human biology varies a lot culturally and in other ways, and the same chemical doesn't take in the same way to everybody. So you can't just dump drugs like that in the water system and then expect everyone to be brainwashed. It never happens that way. In fact, there was another drug developed by the Nazis in Canada in the 1960s called chlorpromazine. And chlorpromazine is another one that even more effective than this early date rape drug, which just renders people into complete vegetables. They just, so much that way that they can't function. So it's a crude method, chemical as well as is crude. So the most effective is what is in place now, and that's electronic. Because don't forget, not only the human brain, but we are simply energy. We are electronic waves and other kinds of energy, right? But the human brain it operates at certain frequencies. So your memories of life, your feelings, your thoughts, they're all at certain wavelengths. And all the technology for the last 30 to 40 years and the research has been into how to duplicate those brain waves and then beam them back at people, right? And you can literally induce whatever memory, whatever thought or feeling you want in people. And it works very effectively, almost 100%. Somebody who did this research early on was telling me, and they want to be anonymous, of course, but they said that there's about 2% who it doesn't take on. 98% of people it's effective, but there is 2%, and they don't know why. And I have my own theory about that. It's kind of more of a, if you want to call it spiritual, that our souls cannot be controlled, but not all of us are in touch with our soul. In fact, most of us aren't. We're not raised in that way to have a sense of our soul identity, right? But those people, some people are naturally inclined that way. And you find more Native people are like that because they're more in touch traditionally with the source of a lot of that, like all of us once were, right? Before technology and so-called modern civilization. So 2% of it doesn't take on generally, but 98% it does. And the way it works is not only does it duplicate whatever brain frequency the people transmitting want to induce in the general population, but it induces whatever emotion they want, right? And it can only work, and that's the kind of the theory now behind what the whole COVID thing was about. It only works if you become a receptor, literally an electronic receptor. And there's a Dr. Catherine Horton, a physicist at Oxford, who went public with this stuff, and she got taken on in a major way. But before she was silenced, she developed this this kind of model of the nanoparticles injected in what are called Trojan horse serums. So, for example, under the guise of a public health emergency, which always works in their so-called herd study analyses of what people will respond to, a public health emergency, almost everybody responds and lines up for the shot. So that's what happened in 2020, right? Pandemic, right? And so everyone lined up, and what was, Catherine believes, and others, was being injected were these nanoparticles that take up position at certain points along the spinal cord here, of course, and in other parts of the body. You literally become a component then of a bigger machine that can, not only, and this is the fourth stage, it isn't just having our mind and everything controlled. We are literally absorbed into a higher mind, a machine mind. We're becoming like individual brain cells in a machine mind. And the proof of that, all you have to do is look around. People below a certain age, they're all like this. Every day, they're on their iPad. And they're not only on their iPad, but I've ridden on the buses and watched carefully. None of them ever let go of it. You'd think that after a while they put it in their bag, but they don't. They're like this. They're holding on to it. And it's usually near their chest. It's because they're setting up a symbiotic energy signal here whereby they can't live without it. So I believe in another 3 to 5 years, before 2030, because that's the target date for this to be complete by, it's going to be announced that iPads are redundant. Now you can operate without any of it. And there was a movie made on this, and it showed these people, and they were sitting there like this, and all they could see on their eyes were information, because they have been integrated. Their mind, it's like creating a new organism, half man, half machine, like a cybernetic organism, where your mind and your thoughts and your energy are literally integrated into a bigger machine network, and you're operating as part of that machine mind. So no more Homo sapiens, no more Homo sapiens. We're Homo machina. We're part of a new global machine organism. And with Musk and that whole direction that's being taken, that is the aim. They are exterminating the human race and making us components of this machine. And they have the technology to do that now. It's happening as we speak. So that is kind of the four stages that I think, well, it's pretty clear we're leading in that direction. And it's all coming from that whole history of how you get people not just slaves, that was the early stage, but now actually integrated so they're not people anymore. They're just components.
Right. And then going into how you said Musk, and talking about the technological side, how they really want to sort of control our DNA in a way, and our genome sequences through different things. I mean, I just read an article today that I believe the UK is going to start doing a DNA test for every single baby that's born
Right.
in the country. And I was like, I mean, they sort of do that anyways. They take blood, and there's different ways that the government has, all over the world, governments have tracks of us, whether it's our fingerprints, our records, social security numbers, whatever it is, a million IDs now that we need to have, but you really do see how it's leading that way where they don't want to just control us with what we do, going to school and paying money and, helping fund things and sort of pushing agendas. But they want to have control of us on a cellular level too. And they're slowly rolling that in and getting us to accept that through things like cell phones and the fear shots, that they're really pushing, whether it's fear or excitement, they're getting us to buy into these things as a society. And we don't realize again how it all goes together. It all looks very separate and compartmentalized from the outside.
Right. Yeah. So again, I mean, it's things are always further along than you realize because the technology they have is always 10 to 20 years in advance of anything we're even aware of, right? Like the military was using the internet in the 1960s. They had it then. And then we didn't hear about it till the late 80s, right? So, I mean, you've got to realize that. And that's why to operate, when we were talking earlier about what to do about it, to operate in the system they set up is just suicide. It's not going to lead anywhere. People need to, the more controlled you are, the more radical has to be the break from what we're part of. And that's asking a lot from most people because I don't think most people are capable of it under the present circumstances. But there is that minority that is. And in all the work now, we try to reach that minority and say, okay, we've got to be the leadership on this. We've got to recover our own minds and autonomy and then lead whoever we can out of the system because otherwise we're not going to be around. I think in another generation or less, probably less time than that, not even a decade, we're not going to be, people will not be able to have this kind of discussion because they won't be allowed to. I mean, it simply won't be in the any more than any of this evidence we published is out there on the internet anymore. It's just swabbed, continually modulated and swabbed. So we've got to fight that to the death. Right?
100%. I couldn't agree more, Kevin. And as you were talking about sort of the, some relationships of the Indigenous community and the experimentation done on them, MK Ultra survivors, even Ann Diamond's testimony, it brought to mind to me too, which I thought was worth mentioning, that I've had actually a bunch of survivors on my show who say that them having some type of Indian bloodline was a reason that they were chosen for the programming and that their parents were, and that
Yeah.
these indigenous tribes are supposed to have higher propensities for psychic abilities and sort of how you were saying, just a different spiritual culture that they embody.
Yeah.
And I thought that that was kind of interesting too, because, when we think about which sort of populations that we've seen experimented on, that we've seen genocided, that we've seen targeted, it's not ever just random. There's always reasons why they want to do it, And I
Yeah.
thought that was kind of an interesting tie-in that I've heard from a lot of survivors.
Yeah, and it isn't unique to Native people today. It was once inherent in all of us, and that's I think I mentioned once before that the electronic frequency of the Earth is the same as that in the human brain. It's a very low frequency, but we're tied in. We're literally, our minds are one with Mother Earth. And you know that when you go out in the real countryside and lie on the earth for half an hour, you're fine. You know, things are feeling really good, right? Like we're in harmony again, right? And that's what I urge. The first thing people need to do is turn off everything and go and do that. Get out in nature, stand by a waterfall. It's so beautiful just to be yourself again, right? And that's the first step of recovery. And you know, and so Native people, yeah, have been closer to that, but that's why they were targeted so badly. And it's like when the Romans invaded England, the first thing they did in the early times, they killed all the Druids. They massacred every Druid they could find because they were the spiritual elders and the leaders, and they were in touch with their long traditions, right? That kept them safe at a basic level from these foreign invaders, right? And control. So there's so much weighing against that happening to us once we've been raised in this culture. We don't even know. And I'll give a little anecdote about that. One of the things I found out is after World War II, the British went through all of their files from the colonial era, and they brought in this thing called legacy files. So they took out anything that refers to a crime by a Crown official, and they substituted it with another file, which rewrote the history and said, no, you know, all these people weren't killed, some were harmed, but they continually created a substitute history all along to make it seem like things were better. Now, that's a really common method now, but it's almost as if within every mind, they're doing the same thing. They're creating a legacy file in every mind of, no, here's the reality. Children weren't harmed. They weren't experimented on. You know, I mean, right now in downtown Vancouver, they have a big Indigenous celebration day, but the very people who killed the children are sponsoring it, the churches. And the United Church is building a big new high-rise. You know, they got lots of money. So a bunch of people stood there with a sign, genocide pays. The United Church is profiting, never went to jail, and look at all the money they got, right? And they're sponsoring these Indigenous days. So it's like, that's the file they're putting in people's minds now. Well, we didn't really do anything wrong, you know? They're really nice people. And, you know, so that substitute narrative is always there. And we have to continually just say, no, here's the evidence, here's the real truth, right?
Yes, that's really, I mean, disgusting in a lot of ways. And it
Yeah.
shows how long this has been going on to where today's generation that would go support an event like this without doing research on the history or listening to somebody like you, they don't make that connection that, oh, the same people sponsoring this are responsible for it. They just look at it like a sponsor and don't understand historically what's going on.
Right. Yeah, and there's another, in one of my books, I talk about this thing called panopticon. It's a really important thing. There was this guy in the 1800s, Jeremy Bentham. He was a philosopher in England, and he created this model prison called a panopticon. The panopticon means all-seeing eye. And he said the way you control a population is you don't do it overtly. You get people to regulate themselves. And people will obey and do what the system wants them to do if they think they're being watched. So Jeremy Bentham designed this prison where there's a central tower and all the prison cells face inward in a big circle, and all the prisoners know they're being watched. And so they literally lock themselves in at night and they go along with the rules, not because there's a guard there with a club, but because there's a guard in their own head saying, obey, I'm being watched all the time. Well, look at any street corner. How many cameras are there watching us, right? The all-seeing eye is there. It's been institutionalized, and we're living in one big panopticon prison. And it's no accident the Masonic symbol of the all-seeing eye, or the eye in the American dollar bill traditionally, right? The all-seeing eye, keeping their big brothers watching you at all times. And so that's the culture. People control themselves. They don't have to be told what to do. Everyone regulates themselves so that they don't get in trouble because they might get hurt. Now, if you say to people, well, who's going to hurt you? Why would you be hurt? They can't answer that. It's just a fear, right? And it's a permanent state of fear created by the way society is set up. I mean, I remember in the 70s when they first brought in cameras in downtown Vancouver, people were smashing them. They were painting over them. People were angry. I'm not going to be monitored by some bloody camera. And then you get used to it because where else can you go, right? And people, a new generation, it's normal to be oh, they're just watching and taking care of us, you know. The slavery is so institutionalized, and when you're raised in it, you got to have somebody to say, wait a minute, you know, use common sense here, people. Why are you being watched?
Right, yeah, and you even see it on social media. People are documenting their lives, they're taping themselves so everybody can see them on every platform, making videos, documenting their lives, showing where they're at, what they're doing, who they're
Right.
hanging out with, so it's almost like they're getting us used to it that way too, through our electronics, like you said. We're so connected to them that like we don't even see the danger of the world outside of us because we're so connected on here and it all looks safe.
And here's the thing, Emma, here's the good side of this. Jeremy Bentham, when he did the panopticon prison, he said you could apply this model to government, to city planning, to policing, prison, whatever. It's a way to get people to regulate themselves. And but it didn't work. He did a study and he found that it didn't work when the prisoners would ignore the central tower and just start talking to each other. He said in those prisons where they had their own communities, they forgot about the panopticon and they were more free. So that's a clue to us. If we forget about the all-seeing eye watching us at all times and put away our devices and just start having normal contact, the feared lessens because we have each other. We have that, and we find that exactly the same thing happens in our assemblies. When people, the more community projects they do together, it could just be planting a garden, or it could be doing something where we have contact with each other. That's our best antidote to mind control. And that's the way support groups happen. You sit in a circle and you support each other, right? I mean, the most basic square one thing. So the panopticon can be fought. It isn't all powerful. They just want you to think they're all powerful when they're not, right?
Yes, and the last episode we had talked about whistleblowing and sort of what you've come out with in a really positive way on the other side of it, ways that it's made you a better person, a stronger person, a more courageous person, lessons that you've learned, and how you sort of overcome the obvious obstacles that will be there. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that's another thing when we're just on our phone and we're alone, even though we feel so connected, we still are so disconnected that we're thinking, oh my gosh, I'm here alone. I'm just one person. What can I do to help all of this stuff that's going on? Where, like you said, if we're getting together and meeting in communities, being with physical humans, all of a sudden we're not just sitting here by ourselves alone with our phone. We have people around us who we can say, all right, what can we all do? And everybody can share their ideas. You give each other courage and you don't have that isolation that can sometimes be really debilitating and just keep us sitting down on the couch instead of actually doing something.
Exactly. And I mean, we need each other. We're made to be with each other as human beings, men and women. It's our nature to be that way. And we're going against our nature when we are isolated, we are relying on machines, right? And that's why, when people say, what's the first thing we can do? Just like what you said, turn off the machines. When we have meetings, we never let people bring in any of their devices, leave them outside. You can't be monitored as easily that way either, right?
Right.
Um, so just get back to basics, right?
Yep. And speaking of that, so let's talk about some solutions because you always come with them, and I love that about you. You can share the really dark things that are going on, but you always shine a light on it by telling us what we can do about it and leading us into a really positive direction that gives us hope and makes us feel courageous. And so where do we start with exposing mind control, helping to bring justice to survivors of these experiments, whether it did happen in an Indigenous school here in America, in Canada, anywhere in the world, if it was governmental mind control, like what we talked about a lot today, how do we sort of navigate this? And maybe you could start by, I know you've covered it a little bit in other episodes, but the difference, just to remind people, between civil court and common law, which is the direction that we're going to be talking about today.
I do want to get to the courts because it's important. It's something people can practically do. But before that, just at a more basic level,
Yeah.
we have to realize that the way you reach people is through their hearts, and the system knows that very well. I mean, Hitler knew that. He said people don't think, they feel, and that's you've got to appeal to the emotions. So the most basic emotion, and you stand in the street and you see some kids run by, and they're all laughing. They're just being children, right? And I was sitting over here, and a bunch of kids were rolling down a hill and laughing together. And I thought, yeah, what it did in me is it made me feel happy, right? And that's not something any machine or anything can ever do for us, right? And so I would say, in the film when we did Unrepentant, which you very thankfully you posted, the point at which people began to have an emotional reaction is not when the natives were describing the tortures that happened to them, right? the people would have like shocked, dull faces. They couldn't relate to these stories. But when I talked about my wife being paid by the church to leave me and take my daughters, whoa! I mean, that just shocked people. They gasp every time we show the film. People gasp at that point because it's something they can relate to at a heart level, right? So we start with the heart and say, when we hold gatherings, we try to include children. We hold them outside. We have music. Um, you know, so that's how you bring people together at that heart level. And you've got to appeal to them when you're talking. Always use specifics. Never talk about a crime in the aspect. Put a name on it. Tell a story about it. Okay, here's what mind control looks like. This person's going to give their story. And encouraging people to use their own words is a hard part, because as a survivor, you tend to automatically use the language of the person who did the crime to you. So when we first got Native people together in talking circles almost 30 years ago now, they began to say, I suffered abuse in a residential school. And I would say, okay, what does that mean? What do you mean abuse? Well, abuse. And say, no, what does it mean? What happened to you? And often one of the bravest people, usually they're older women, they would come forward and say, no, he tortured me, right? He used this thing on me, right? And describe what happened to her. And then people would break down and cry, and then they would start using their own words, because somebody had the courage to break the ice and speak from the heart and cry and sob and wail, say, they robbed my life from me, and then that opens up other people to start using your language, because you're always speaking through the language of the system and the oppressor, if you like. And to find your own words is so powerful, because then it empowers you. And the very same people who were able to do that were the ones with us when we were occupying the church. That's no accident, because it gave them the courage to act together. Like when William Coombs said, I didn't want to let you guys down. I had to go in there with you. And he overcame his fear of those priests, right, who had tortured him so badly. We did that together, and we did it by going to the heart and getting them to recover their voice, right? And so I would say that's a real important part of holding these groups, is to recover our voice. And somebody has to have the courage to break the ice to allow the others to then, follow that lead. And so then you can do courts. Then you can start, but that's kind of like step 3. If we haven't done the personal recovery, that's not going to happen. It's just going to be another idea that people won't be able to act on, right?
And I want to comment on that before you move on to the next step,
Yeah.
that the language even that you used, where kind of I'm a victim of this, I'm a victim of this, to no, he did this. All of a sudden now you're able to take that blame that's always been shouldered on you, and me, and say, no, it's he, it's this person, it's them. And so, and because you're not allowed, these victims weren't allowed to say those things whenever they were younger. They had to always like internalize it and take the blame and just carry it. And so I thought that was really powerful too, hearing how the narrative changed too, with it going from, me to no, them, they're the ones to blame. Like, it's not me. I'm taking this weight off my shoulder now.
Yep. Yeah, Harriet said that. Harriet Nahani, one of the first people who were on a protest, she had that famous line, I'm not a victim anymore, I'm a threat.
Oh, I
And
love that.
I I understand why they were trying to kill us, because of they wanted the land and they wanted to wipe out our sacred knowledge, which kept us on the land, right? Now I see why, and there's that old saying where suffering is no longer suffering when there's a meaning behind it, right? When you find a meaning for what happened to you as a child, then you're not just this helpless target anymore, right? You can start recovering. And so that's something people find naturally, but you need, I remember this anecdote from the Civil War. This one general, I forget who it was, the Union general, he used to ride up and down the line when the fighting was started on horseback in full exposure of all the bullets and cannon fire to show his men that they didn't have to be afraid. And that's what each of us needs to do who are leaders in this. And that's why I always, at these events, I'm always front and center saying, look, we don't have to be afraid of these people. Okay, I'm going to stand here in full fire, full range of their fire, and say, they're the ones who are afraid of us. They're hiding behind the police and all the so-called laws and everything, but they're the ones who are afraid because they know they're in the wrong, and we know we have more power because we have a truth that they want to bury, right? And you got to be brave that way to lead the others. And then it's just I don't know, Emma, like to describe at those moments when people respond to that, and the moment we all just flowed into that church, there's 50 of us, all of them broken survivors, if you like. They got transformed the minute we walked into that church and occupied it. We were together, and then we were unbeatable. That's why the priests turned and fled in fear. It's like counting coup, right? We just took their power, boom, and that's the stage that's got to happen after, and the courts and everything, that's fine, but that's kind of formal. The real point is when you reclaim the energy, which we did, and we redirected the narrative. After that, everyone used the word genocide after that day, right? Because we rewrote the language through our actions, and it's possible. You just got to take that leadership all the time.
There's a book that I read a long time ago, actually, about a Holocaust survivor who sort of detailed his survival. His name
Mm-hmm.
is Viktor L. Frankl, and his book is called Man's Search for Meaning. And I
Great
wanted to
book.
bring it up because it's a short book. It's a hard read in the beginning,
Mm-hmm.
but essentially he details what you just said, how he survived strategically was finding some little whim of hope to hang on to every single day, something to motivate him to keep going. And he would be able to tell through people's language that were in the concentration camp with him who would be the next person to die because they wouldn't have something that they were holding on to anymore. And he would say, why do I only honor and sort of celebrate and go hard at the things that are positive in my life, the successes, the achievements? We need to attack our suffering in that same way and face it head on, find a meaning behind it, pursue that meaning, and create an action behind it so we can keep pedaling when that adversity wants us to do the opposite and curl up and freeze up, but like we don't do that when something good happens. And so
Right.
he pretty much, says that to approach adversity with the same vigor that we would a success or an achievement. And I think that that's a really great lesson for survivors because they were never told to do that. They were always suppressed through their fear and through their suffering and abuse, and giving them that power to say, now take it and create something or do something good with it. Take your power back. Put the blame where it belongs, not on you. Like that alone can save people's lives.
Yes,
It's really
very
cool
much.
to see even in your own testimony how
Mm-hmm.
you've done that with so many people just by giving them that opportunity to have that power back.
Well, it's a beautiful book, and that's all so right on because in his book, like he says, the ones who survived Auschwitz weren't the ones who had better food or anything. They had something more than their own pain to live for, more than their own life. Some of them were involved in the camp underground. Some had a great love they were holding on to, or they did something creative every day. But you got to get the focus has to go away from your own suffering onto the higher thing, living for others, you know, um, helping others. And you see that so much in really destitute areas, like down on the downtown east side here, all the time. I was standing there talking to my Frank. Guy comes up, offers me a doob, offers me some food, whatever. People automatically share in that situation because they know they've only got each other. Okay, and when we reach that point in our own struggle, it's so easy to make that jump because we want to get out of our suffering. We don't want to kind of stew in it. We want to see a way to change it, not only for ourselves but for everybody, so this stuff stops, right? And and so yeah, that's I really urge people to get that book, Man's Search for Meaning. And he, yeah. Anyway, I can't say enough of that book.
I know, me too. I don't want to say I didn't have high hopes, but it was so short that I was like, what kind of big lesson could really be in here? And it is a hard read. There's some hard things that he talks about that he went through, but man, I mean, I think I read that book probably 15 years ago at least. Probably actually longer than that. And I think I literally think about it every single day, and it always pops in my mind whenever there's something hard that's in front of me, and it's not always the easiest thing to overcome those feelings of wanting to kind of curl up or get angry or sad, whatever the negative thing is that we express, but having that in the back of my mind of this isn't going to stop me, we got to keep going no matter what. Like what can motivate me to get through this? Like you said, what's bigger than my pain and suffering?
Right.
What's something that I can hold on to? Giving that gift again to a survivor is just absolutely life-changing.
Yeah, and I know Viktor Frankl, in his book, said that he developed what they called the third school of psychology. and it's called logotherapy. And logo means meaning. So with all of, he said in his working as a psychologist after World War II, the first question he asks a client who's gone through a lot of grief and is caught in kind of crisis in their life, he says, "Why haven't you killed yourself?" First question he asks. Why haven't you? What's prevented you? Right? And they have to think, okay, so why haven't I? And it varies a lot with each person, but he always finds the thread whereby we're looking for meaning, because as we need meaning to our existence. Why are we here? I used to say in sermons, the most basic question of life, none of us can really answer. Why are you here? And people are like, I've never thought about that. Well, why wouldn't we be thinking about that? From day one, why not only in a general sense, but why I, Kevin Annett, why am I here? What is my purpose in being here? And each person puts their own name in that. And once you find, there's no such thing as the meaning of life, the meaning of your life. What is the meaning of your life? Maybe it's just to go out and get there and help whoever, right? But there is a meaning for your existence. And once you find that, you're unbeatable, and it's not it's not rocket science, right? We uncover that naturally, but we have to be encouraged in that discovery, right?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think you and I can probably both attest. People probably look at us sometimes like we're crazy for constantly diving into like this really dark stuff and like having it consume so much of our lives. But I think of it as the opposite. This gives me life. This is something, knowing
Right.
that I'm doing something for people outside of myself, for a cause that's affecting the whole world,
Yeah.
knowing that there's people that would love to be in my shoes to be able to just talk freely about these things that we get to talk about. It's an opportunity to change yourself internally whenever you create something from the disparity of the world. Otherwise, before I had my podcast, I felt so helpless at home, just this like heaviness of knowing that these things were happening. I'm learning about it and curious and studying it, opening up my eyes, my whole world cracks open, just like how yours did.
Right.
And the last thing that I could have done was just sit there and not do anything. Like I
Yeah.
had to do something for my own emotional stability to get me through the darkness that I was looking at, and it gives me purpose. Even, whenever I'm having bad days or something, this sort of centers me because I'm like, wait, but you get to fight for something that's so
Right.
important. And you get to do this every day and you get to give people voices and get to advocate for them. Like,
Right.
let's focus on that instead of these things that are sort of coming at you and making you feel
Right.
stuck in your suffering, right?
Exactly. And the thing about the fear of the dark places, it's like kids' fear of the darkness, right? When we're kids, we're afraid of the dark. And when my daughter Eleanor, who's especially, she's in her 30s now, but when she was little, very emotional, right? She used to break into tears when she saw a homeless man on the street and insist that we give him his lunch, right? And just it's all heart. And so at night, when Eleanor would cry out and scared of the dark, I'd go in and say, "Come on, sweetie." I'd carry her out, would go outside in the dark, and I'd point out all the stars. And I'd start talking about the universe and the stars and all this stuff. And then she got so fascinated. Said, "See, the dark isn't that scary, is it now? Look what you're learning. Look what you're discovering, right?" And nowadays she always tells me how much she remembered that, because it was just a simple way of saying, "I love you and I want to show you that there's nothing to be afraid of," right? And I think we need to do that in every day with ourselves and with others. Right?
What meaning did you find in your own suffering, and how did you get through a lot of the disparity that, was thrown at you for standing up for this? What was the meaning in your life that you cultivated?
Well, I had advantages because I already had done this kind of work before to some degree. It wasn't just the emotional impact was like a ton of bricks, and it almost crushed me. There were some days where I did feel crushed and I didn't operate. But most of the time I did, because I realized, wait a minute, like I'd be in that state for about half a day and then go, wait, something in me would go boing. No, you're not going here. Like another voice, another part of me said, you're not going there because that's what they want. And you want them to win, these bastards? No. Okay, your children are looking to you, other children, other people are depending on you. You can't sit there. So there's just this spring mechanism in me that would always bounce me back into the fight, right? And so I was blessed to have that. And those of us who have that ability, we have an obligation to get play a leadership role with the others. Not like I'm the leader, but catalyst to lead the rest. And that worked. And that's why the smear on me is so extensive still, because people, the powers that be don't, or that appear to be, don't want people to learn from that example, right? That's all. And so the experiences I had every day with just being with others and seeing their courage, and every time we did something, it got confirmed. By the way, I remember Harriet at one of our first protests at the church. She pointed at all these angry Catholics going in, who were screaming at us and everything, and she said, "Of course they did it. Look, they're admitting it. Look how they're acting. Because if they didn't do it, why would they wouldn't be reacting this way, right? They all know it. They all know they're guilty. So think of the power that gives us, right? And so you always, the old saying is, in a fight, your best ally can be your enemy, because they do things which help you all the time, but only if your eyes are open and you're not afraid of them, and everything that happens, you're able to look at it and say, okay, how's that going to help what we're trying to bring out, right?
Yes. And even going back to the whole community thing, to have people there to sort of hold you accountable too, to listen to the suffering of others, to have genuine conversations with people, and to hear the humanity in all of us instead of just this picture perfect world too, I think really helps us keep grounded to make us feel, wow, like I'm having a really bad day, but look what all these other people went through and like they got through it. So that means I can too. We can
Right.
really draw inspiration and courage from seeing people who have suffered more than us, and like you said, to give hope to people who have even suffered less than us in some ways and might be scared to or don't feel connected to actually standing up to doing something. We can lead that change by saying, well, I didn't go through that either, but it's so important and here's why. And we need to all come together and fight this. It's bigger than all of us. I think
Right.
there's so many different roles that all of us can take, and I really, like I said, I really commend you for continuing to keep going, because it's really sad how many people start advocating or start caring about something, and then quickly the outside world shuts them up again and they fall prey to the tactics that, like you said, they want you to shut up. They want you to be scared. They want you to retreat and isolate, and when you can overcome that, it's really special. Like you grow as a person. You're like, how did that even bother me?
Right.
Like it's just a stupid tactic. Like obviously they're the ones that are scared, like you said. I mean, your own case, look how many hundreds of thousands of dollars they threw at you to try to shut you up. Again, if you were just like some person that they didn't care about, that didn't matter, who didn't have something important to say, why would they have gone through all that effort? It was obvious that they were terrified of you. And like that's a really empowering position to be in, to be like,
It,
okay, this sucks. Like I don't have all that money that they do to try to combat this. But man, they must be scared of me if they're going through all this effort to try to make me be quiet.
oh yeah, well, I mean, that's what I mean all the time. Your adversary is showing what you're saying.
Yeah.
It's like when I heard that they all have pictures of me in all the downtown churches. I said, that is so
Oh,
great. I mean, they're so afraid. This is so good. This only helps us, right? And so I mean, but here's the thing to realize too, that people are never shut down by somebody else. They're shut down by themselves.
mhm.
And you know, it's unfortunate because then you don't have the experience. You don't acquire the experience whereby you can overcome your fear and you have the long view. People want a quick result, and if you can't get it, I don't want to risk anything. Therefore, I'm dropping out. Well, you're just screwing yourself by doing that. You're kind of diminishing yourself, because the point is to not to be diminished, but to expand. Like I say to people, when your heart is broken in love, okay, yeah, it feels horrible, but by being cracked, it opens a bit and expands a bit. And in fact, a broken heart makes it bigger. And it's true about all of us that we mature and we gain wisdom from that and determination, you know.
Yeah, there's a quote I think about a lot. I have no idea where I heard it because it was forever ago, but it was just something really simple. Stop thinking, start making. And sometimes when I'm in those really negative states that are really hard to overcome, that's like a really quick thing to do, even if it's just like getting up and like making my room clean, just doing something. If we can create through our
Right.
pain, and some of the most, you hear about musicians and movies and art, a lot of that stems from somebody's pain, a way to express it, and so I think that that's such a good foundational step to creating change, is to find meaning in your suffering, to find purpose in your pain, to give the story that was supposed to bring you down the
Mhm.
power to lift other people up and it changed lives. I think that that's a wonderful first step, Kevin. And what's next? What do we do after we accomplish that? And again, thank you for talking about this. It's a good, it empowers me too to talk about this stuff sometimes.
Good.
And just to like even remind myself of these lessons that we can learn that are really positive in a lot of this darkness that we talk about. So I appreciate you.
Thank you. And it's it's unusual for somebody to be willing to walk into that place, right? And but we find this, that the more you walk, the more the darkness parts, and you realize it wasn't there in the first place. That it was mostly here. 90% of fear is in the head, and it's not in the real world. So, that's kind of a good operating principle on all of this work, I think, to follow.
I agree. And so let's go to step two. What do we do after we find meaning and we find a reason to go on despite all the adversity that we're going to be facing?
Share it with others, and by that I don't mean send them an email or something, but I mean share it in a real way. And that's why you've got to work locally and forget about the big pictures. We're inundated with information and with seeing all the problems in the world, and that's not the issue. The issue is, what can you do about it right where you are, right? And it is all around you. It's just that we're not aware of it. But seek out the people, and the best way to do that, what I always used to do, even as a young man, was you go find the people sitting on the street corner and you just listen to them, and they will tell you a lot of stuff you didn't know about, right happening in your own backyard. Some kid being trafficked, what happened to them, the local corrupt cop, whatever. And you can start that. By starting locally, you're empowered 10 times more than you would be, trying to set up Zoom calls all over the planet. Because like you say, it doesn't really feed us and allow us. Remember growing up in the 70s, this is before computers and all that. And we'd put up a poster, and it's the only way you could communicate, a telephone call or a poster. And a couple of hundred people would show up, and the only contact you would have is immediate with each other, face to face. And that gave us a sense of strength and relying on each other. You could see right away who were the, sunshine patriots and who are the ones who are going to really fight, okay? And you naturally could connect a lot quicker that way. Nowadays, you get information quicker, but you don't get that. You don't get that bonding that happens. We knew intuitively right away who we could rely on, and they had our back. We had each other's backs quicker in that sense. That's what I see lacking today, because you don't get that sense from this cyber world people are in, right? And that's why local action is so essential. I mean, you can be in touch like I am all over the world to help trigger that, but I say now the responsibility is on you guys. Something as basic as your local Catholic Church, right? They're trafficking children. You can rely on it because they're allowed to and encouraged to do it. And it's big money. And start putting out a call, right? People have any information on this? You can start anywhere because the problem is everywhere, right?
Yeah, that's a really good point too. And I think even if people are really connected online, or if that is something that people feel connected with, instead of just talking in a DM or in an email, jump on a Zoom call, and actually get to talk to people. I think that's really powerful too, because we do
Mm-hmm.
have the opportunity to meet different people, which is exciting, and get people in other states or other areas to help do what you're doing,
Mm-hmm.
to figure out together how you guys can connect with people in the community, what different ways that you guys can, how you guys can sort of contact these Catholic churches. What are you all going to say, whenever you go? Do you guys have some markers of places to
Oh
start?
yeah,
There's
yeah,
a lot of different ways too that you can help strategize and like get motivated for what you're going to do locally by connecting with people elsewhere.
yeah. Like, and as a matter of fact, after all these interviews over the last couple of months, one of the first things people ask for is, what can I hand out? So we've got these flyers we send out. Just start showing them to local Catholics. Tell them stop putting money in the collection plate, stop funding child trafficking. That sparks all sorts of stuff. When people, one person filling out that form and sticking it in the collection plate, it sends shockwaves all over the place because they were aware. And I get this back from people, the priest went on a tirade from the pulpit about not contributing to the church. And that got us all kind of wondering, like, what is wrong with this guy, right? I mean, it's like being the fly in the elephant's ear. You can continually provoke this big beast to act. And by acting, It's like it was an old guerrilla war strategy. You would provoke the colonial master to come down on people, and that got people a lot more determined to fight than any amount of propagandizing to them would. It's the brutality of the system. Once it hits people, it creates a big audience for what we're talking about. That's why so many people joined our republic after the COVID measures, right? Tenfold increase, because they realize, okay, we've got to do something now. In the real world, this is hitting us. So you got to go to those places where that happens, and you find lots of recruits. They just need leadership, and we've got the resources and the example and the organization. People have just got to plug into our networks, and we can, help this process everywhere, right?
Do you have those flyers online, or how can people get an example or a printout of the things that you've created to help?
They are online, but some of the flyers are antiquated. We've updated them. The best thing to do is write to me, and at that email you've got for me.
Okay. And you also, I
And
think, have a contact page on your email too, right? Or sorry, on your website.
yeah, but I would just write to angelfire101 at protonmail. It's .com. It's the most secure.
That's wonderful. You've created that. I encourage you guys on the other side. I think that's one of the other hard parts is people don't know what to say. So if you
Mm-hmm.
can just print something out and hand it to somebody, get it out in the community, take it to church with you. I think that there's a lot of different ways that this can be really helpful to help motivate people and sort of get them out of that fear stage of like taking that first step.
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, we also do training workshops. This is one advantage we do online is that next week, I'm doing an educational workshop with people in England who want to know how to do exactly that. How do we approach these churches? How do we, the banishment and reclamation campaign of Native people who go in and just take the church back, tell the priest to get off their land, that kind of thing. How do we do that in our community? What are the arguments we raise? We do kind of role-playing sessions where one guy pretends to be the angry priest and you've got to respond and learn how to, what to say to these people, right? And we do all that as well. So that's the next stage. Besides, after education, there's training, practical training, and then organization into cells and assemblies to put, you've got to hang these ideas on a framework, organization of some kind. Otherwise, you can't work consistently. It's just one person talking to another. And so you need organization. It's like I often say, you got steam, but you don't want to move unless you have the piston. The steam
Mm.
moves the piston. You need both the spirit and the organization, right?
How can people join those Zoom calls? Do you have, is anybody invited to that or should they reach out to you?
Well, they should reach out to me. Don't forget, we got groups in a lot of countries now operating. The folks in England took off because a lot of my books are being bought in England now. It's funny, about 70% of my books are bought by Americans, about 25% by people in England, and only about 3% Canadians. Because even though it all started here and was based here, because Canadians are like afraid of the name, the effectiveness has been extensive in Canada, and unfortunately, but that's because it's so close to the crime. They got it. The closer you get to the crime, the more fog you have to make the people there, right? So
Yeah, of course, not to mention all the ways that they've tried keeping your name out of the sort of
yeah.
public consensus and knowledge of people there, and all the ways that they've silenced you and taken credit that you have earned from your efforts away, whether it's offline or, they've completely like erased all of the progress and the things that you've accomplished there, which is really sad.
Well, erased at least from that, but don't
Right.
forget, it's the knowledge of it is so out there now that they can't erase that. Too many people know now. That's why they don't kill me because too many people know. Right? So
Right.
I
And
mean,
they don't sue you because they don't want to go to court and have to, try to prove you otherwise because they know that they couldn't.
that's right. Yeah.
And so, speaking of court, I believe you said that was the third step. And so, let's talk about we have actually getting in communities. Step one was finding purpose and finding a why, that reason that's bigger than you to do this, finding sort of finding that motivation, that beauty in suffering. And so after that community is, and now we're getting into court, correct?
That's one way to go. I mean, that's for people who want to actually bring a case against an individual or big institution. It's a bit more complex because people need kind of basic knowledge and they don't have the confidence to say, okay, we're a court. I mean, they say, can we do that? Is it legal? All that. That's kind of the basic question they get. can't
Yeah.
get around in their own minds. So often a step towards that is you start with your own investigation, and there's ways to do that. It depends on the issue, and that we have ways to help people do that. But when you get to the point of the court, it's best just to read our common law training manual, which we've talked about before, and I think you have posted.
Mm-hmm.
And the companion piece to that is the whistleblower manual, because it equips you to how to deal with the attacks that you're inevitably going to face, right? And we did a great show on that last time.
Yeah, it was fantastic last time. And I do encourage, I'll have those episodes in the show notes too. I definitely encourage you guys to go listen to those. I'll have the whistleblower manual. You guys can get that off of his website too. All these books are also found on Amazon, but I'd encourage you to maybe go on his website, click on one of his books, and then find his actual name. I'm sure that Kevin's work has been plagiarized, or there's probably people that try to rip him off on there. So just make sure that you guys are actually getting your books from him, and that they're the original books. But you guys can find those on his website, murderbydecree.com, as well as amazon.com. If you guys are able to find one book, you guys should be able to find all of his books. And so, what comes after this? And if you want to talk a little bit about court, maybe that would be an option some people would want to take. And I know that
Yeah.
you and I are also going to work on helping champion um, people coming together and trying to pursue justice in a
Right.
more meaningful and productive way than the typical civil courts.
Right. So the court cases usually are divided between civil and criminal. Civil is like a personal action you try to work out with somebody. Criminal action is something more serious and that threatens the whole community. And criminal law is defined like things like criminal acts, genocide, rape is considered an offense against the whole community, not just against one person. And these criminal issues that we've been documenting for so long, right? And when you do a criminal case, which is a lot of these consist of, trying to make an argument that this system, the particular system like a church or something like chemtrails even, or things going on, it's a very difficult thing to do in a way, because you've got to prove your case beyond a reasonable doubt. And so you see, we operate according to law, common law, which is that you assume the person is innocent, not guilty. And sometimes people get in because they've got an axe to grind, they want to get this person. There's no guarantee what an outcome is going to be in a common law court, because you have jury members who will on their own decide if something people are guilty or not. But you have to prove your case, and it's very difficult to prove that this particular person is directly tied to and responsible for this thing that happened to this person. That's why so many criminals get off, because they haven't proved their case, and so the accused walk in that situation. But our advantage with this work is that it's not just about individuals harming individuals. There's a whole system at work. And at the Nuremberg trials, remember Robert Jackson, the US prosecutor, said, you don't have to prove the guilt of every individual concentration camp guard to make your case against the system, because they're all part of a collective evil. And when part of a group crime is what they called it. When you're in a group crime, the usual thing you have to prove to prove crime, you have to prove an act and an intention. Okay, you need act and intent. Intent is implicit. Obviously, when you got a system like in Canada where there were thousands of children dying every year and they never did anything to stop it, there's an intent there shown. They want the children to die. Therefore, anyone in the system, including the guy who drives the bus every morning to the school, and the cop who covers it up, and the priest, they're all collectively guilty. And so it's called vicarious liability in law. So it means if you're the head of this corporation, like the Pope in Rome, you're automatically guilty. You're responsible for everything your employees did under law. And that's why the fact that the Pope and presidents and that aren't on trial, or King Charles in England, it proves the system is protecting them. Therefore, the system is criminal. I mean, you see, it's so simple when you take it up, but you can only know that once you've started a case. Right? Because otherwise you're living in this la-la land. Everyone lives in, we have justice, we have accountables. No, we don't. There is no justice till you create it. And that's the purpose of these courts, right? So that people have got to know that first before getting into the nuts and bolts. Nuts and bolts are simple. You put out a statement of claim, what you want. You call jury members. There's a whole procedure you follow. But you got to know why you're doing it and how to go about it. Otherwise, it's kind of just talk, right?
Absolutely, yes. And so again, this is Kevin talks about the common law court system and common law in general, and he has some really great literature about that if you guys are interested. And we'll have some updates too on ways that we're trying to work with survivor groups and, help get some of this justice through these different ways that Kevin has learned through his own experiences, actually trying the court systems in different ways and actually educating himself on it. So I'm really excited about that. And what else do you want to add to kind of seeking justice in ways that people can start, coming together and, creating solutions?
I think we've touched on some really important things about how to do that kind of in a basic
Yeah.
human level. And the important thing is not to sit on this knowledge, but try something. And, in kind of our workshops, and I remember years ago as a community organizer, I used to say to people, it doesn't matter what you do, just start something. Because you don't learn from a book, you don't learn from talking. If you get 10 people in a room talking, you'll have 10 reasons not to do something. You'll just sit there and talk ad infinitum. But if you go and do something together, you all learn the same experience. You know, that's why these church actions were so important, because we'd all go down, do an action, the cops would show up, would have an interaction with them, would get harassed. Then we would always get together after and debrief and say, what happened? Oh yeah, I learned this and that. And we learned a lot more in that experience, and it was a common knowledge. We all shared it, and that way, we all had a common motive to do it next time. But if everyone, you see, everything is so talk based now that people say, "Oh yeah, I read this online. I did something today. I learned something." No, you didn't do anything. You learned something, and then you got to apply that knowledge. So I would say with people, just go and try anything. Just do something, and try to do it with other people, and then you'll learn a great lesson. And the important thing is to then carry it to the next step. Because if you do something once or 10 times, you got to do something over a consistent period of time for it to have an impact. We're in it for the long haul, in other words. You got to learn how to pace yourself to be a long distance runner or fighter.
Right. Yeah. You don't just become a star athlete from one day of practice. It's dedication, and it's showing up every day for it, which lucky for us is something that you've done all these decades, to be able to help shine a light on this and connect all these dots for us and just provide so much valuable insight on all of these different aspects of the systemic abuse system that we live in, not to mention the solutions that you always come equipped with. Was there anything else today about mind control, about the Indigenous schools, about change that you wanted to talk about today?
There probably is somewhere, but we've covered so much that
Yeah.
I want people to be able to digest this beat, and then we can try some other things. But I think we did our usual good combination of things, and I'm really happy again about this interview today.
I am too. It's really nice to have these genuine conversations, and hopefully, it's really encouraging to people, especially because somebody like you make yourself very available for people to ask questions, to get advice. You have all these books, all these interviews, your documentary, which I'm going to have all of that in the show notes for you guys. That's also a really great way that you guys can take action. It doesn't, if you're really busy, if you have a family, if you're really limited on time, money, resources, a really great thing that you can do is just buy Kevin's books, give him his gifts, share them on your social media, share his documentary, promote his work. There's so many ways that we can give back that really aren't expensive, they're not time consuming, and they can make a huge impact just from your own home if that's where you are working from, or if that's, something that maybe a place you want to start. So you can be as simple as that, taking Kevin's interviews whenever he does one, share it on your Facebook, share it on Twitter, share it on your social media, repost his video, Unrepentant, the documentary that he did about the Indigenous schools and the crimes against humanity that he discovered. There's so many different ways that we can help out, and go back and listen to this, take some notes. If you're listening to, I do have a Substack where after every episode, I do a comprehensive breakdown of some of the key bullet points that were talked about, listing important websites, and just sort of doing an overview. So I kind of make a checklist for you guys. Episodes like this are great for that because it sort of goes over the different flow that we had and the checkpoints and the different subjects matters that we talked about. So I'm going to have that in the show notes too. My Substack, you guys can get that delivered right to your email. Kevin, remind people where they can keep up with you.
Murderbydecree.com, republicofcanada.org. First and third Sundays of every month, we do Radio Free Canada at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. bbsradio.com. Oh, I blew that again. 9 a.m. Pacific, noon Eastern Time. First and third Sunday of the month. And bbsradio.com, Radio Free Canada.
And I'll have your email and phone number. Very generous of you to give us so many ways that we can connect with you in the show notes as well. And is there anything else that you wanted to say today, Kevin, before we wrap up?
Just thank you, Emma. As usual, it was great.
It's an honor, Kevin. Can't wait to do it again. I'm really grateful that you've become a recurring guest. I know the other people on the other side of the screen appreciate it too. So, you guys, I'll have all Kevin's information in the show notes. Go check out his websites, buy his book, share his content, keep up with him. He also has an email list where you guys can get right to your inbox all the different interviews that he's doing, different updates. So connect with him, email him, and reach out if you guys want to organize a call with him, if you guys would like flyers that we talked about. If you just have any questions or want some advice, he makes himself really available, really personable, and as a resource for you guys. So please take advantage of that if that's something that maybe you want to help champion in your own town, city, state, church. Again, no act is too small, and Kevin's proof that one person can really make a difference and change the course of history. So, Kevin, it's an honor to have you on. I'll have all my notes in the, or excuse me, all my links in the show notes as well. You guys connect with me wherever you can. We couldn't do this without you. Thank you guys for listening. Bless you all, and we will see you next time.